It was a Tuesday in mid-September. Hot wind blew out of eastern New Mexico like God was exhaling dust. And out in front of the Mora County courthouse, they were selling off what was left of a man. His name was Jettton. Folks used to call him Jet, back when he rode tall in the saddle and had 80 head of cattle grazing from Wagon Mound to Watrous. But now, he sat in a rusted-out wheelchair, legs bound in old cavalry braces, cradling 2 squirming, red-faced infants in his lap. They were like the only thing still anchoring him to this earth. And maybe they were. The auctioneer had already sold off the branding irons, the ox cart, and the last of Jetton's usable fencing. Next up were the livestock, what little was left of them. 3 cows, 2 starved to moo, a busted plow mule with 1 good eye. And then came the part that made people shift in their boots. The twins. Legal guardianship of 2 female minors, 12 weeks old, the auctioneer said without blinking. Offered as dependent assets per foreclosure clause. Twins go with the land. Jettton didn't look up. He just clutched those babies tighter, his knuckles bone white. Across the square, no one moved, except for one person. She was standing off near the watering trough outside McGregor's saddlery, one hand on her lower back, the other resting lightly on a worn satchel stitched with her initials, Vera Rose. No one knew her name yet, but they'd remember her for decades to come. She hadn't come to town for drama, just water, maybe a biscuit. She was 6 months along, carrying the weight of a future she hadn't planned in a dress that didn't quite fit anymore. Dust on her boots, a cracked gold wedding band on her finger. She'd only meant to pause, but then she heard that cold announcement about the twins, about the ranch, and something inside her didn't just stir. It snapped. She crossed the square before she knew why she was doing it. The banker sneered when he saw her. "You looking to buy yourself a cow or a child?" he said, half laughing. She didn't flinch. "I'm looking to buy back a man's dignity." The square went quiet, and then she did the unthinkable. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a coin pouch, one she'd sewn shut with fishing line so she wouldn't be tempted to open it. It held everything she had. Savings from a boarding job in Texas, a few coins from a pawned brooch, and a wad of dollars from a widow who said, "Go west and start over." She didn't count it out. She didn't haggle. She raised her voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. $350. Jettton blinked. The auctioneer froze. The banker paled. "I beg your pardon," the auctioneer said. "You heard me," Vera said. $350 for the debt, the land, and the babies. The banker sputtered. "That's not how any of this works." But the auctioneer scratched his beard. "Actually, that's the full amount owed, down to the penny." "You got a pen?" Vera asked. "Or do I need to spit in your hand?" Jettton didn't say a word. Didn't breathe, maybe. His arms had gone slack with shock. One of the twins started to fuss, her tiny fist punching the air. And still, Vera stood there, belly round, boots scuffed, eyes calm, like a woman who'd seen things burn before and wasn't afraid of a little more smoke. The papers were signed, the banker stormed off, and just like that, she became the legal owner of a ranch, 2 babies, and a stranger in a wheelchair who hadn't asked for mercy. But mercy was what he got. That afternoon, as the sun crawled down toward the mesa line, Jettton looked up at her from the creaking porch of what used to be his house and said the first words she ever heard him speak. "You don't know what you just bought into." Vera knelt beside him, took the weight of one sleeping baby from his lap, and cradled her like she already belonged. "No," she said, "but I reckon you and I are about to find out." The house smelled like grief and horses. The front door sagged on one hinge. The kitchen roof let rain in whether it rained or not, and every floorboard had a story to tell, most of them sad. Vera slept in the pantry the first few nights, curled on flour sacks and listening to coyotes scrape the edge of the hills. The babies shared a laundry basket by the hearth, bundled in old quilts with their names, Brinley and Rose, stitched in thread too faded to see. Jettton stayed mostly quiet, but his eyes never left her. He watched her rock the babies at dawn, bare feet pressed to the cool floor, murmuring lullabies half sung, half prayed. He watched her haul buckets from the well when the pump cracked its last gasp. He watched her burn her fingers trying to bake sourdough with no starter, then laugh anyway, cradling her belly and whispering, "We're going to learn, little one." By the third week, the ranch was breathing again. Slowly, painfully, but breathing. They fixed the east fence using salvaged timber and wire borrowed from a neighbor 2 ridges over. Jettton sat in his chair at the gate, hammer in hand, guiding her arm until she learned to set the staples just right. "You hit the post like you're mad at it," he grinned once. "That's 'cause I am." The cattle, what was left of them, began to recover. Vera added oats and herbs to their feed, swearing it helped. Jettton didn't argue, not because he believed in the oats, but because she made the place feel warm again. She found his late daughter's sewing chest one night in the attic. Inside were unfinished quilt squares, each one marked with initials, years, bits of ribbon from dresses long gone. Vera sat for hours tracing the fabric with trembling hands. Then she started stitching. Every evening, once the babies were asleep and Jettton had wheeled himself out onto the porch to stare at nothing, Vera lit a lamp and brought out the quilt. One stitch at a time, one memory resurrected. "You don't have to finish it," Jettton said once. "I know," she whispered. "But someone should." As weeks turned to months, their rhythms knotted together. She learned how to trim hooves and boil prickly pear jelly. He learned how to warm bottles and pat colicky backs. She found an old photograph in the barn. He played a lullaby on a guitar he hadn't touched since his daughter was 12, and in that strange stillness, they found each other. But peace never lasts long in the West. It was a letter that shattered it. Postmarked from Amarillo. No return address. Vera read it in the kitchen, then folded it carefully and slid it into the fire. Jettton didn't ask, but she told him anyway. "I used to work in an orphanage," she said. "Helped my husband keep the books. He found things he shouldn't have. A money trail. Children being shuffled like cattle. He died 2 weeks later. Fell down a flight of stairs, they said." She swallowed hard, pressed a hand to her belly. "I knew they were coming for me. I ran." Jettton looked at her for a long time, then nodded once. "I've been running too," he said, "only I didn't move." She smiled at that, but her eyes stayed wet. There was more. The letter said he was coming. Her stepbrother. The man who'd helped frame her, the man who now held influence in 3 counties and wore a deputy's badge he didn't earn. And Jettton. Jettton went still. "That's the same name as the man who signed off on my foreclosure," he said. They stared at each other. The silence between them was suddenly electric. He hadn't just stolen Vera's life, he'd stolen Jetton's too, and now that man knew where they both were. It began with dust, just a fine thread of it twisting on the horizon like smoke from a dying fire. Jettton knew, before Vera even stepped out on the porch, that the wind had changed, that the land had shifted, and that whatever peace they'd managed to borrow from the world was about to come due. The man who rode up 3 hours later didn't come alone, and he didn't bother hiding behind pleasantries or paper. He wore a tin star that glinted like mockery on his chest, and rode with 2 other men, hired muscle, rough and stone-faced, the kind that wouldn't blink twice at shooting a woman or a pair of crying babies if it meant collecting a bounty. Vera didn't flinch when she saw him, though her hand went instinctively to her belly. Jettton, sitting straight in his wheelchair on the porch like some battle-worn general, didn't offer a greeting, only let his calloused fingers rest against the smooth wood of the rifle across his lap. "You're harboring a fugitive," the man said, his voice oily and thick with satisfaction, like he'd been waiting months to say those words out loud, "and unlawfully detaining 2 minors who aren't yours to keep." But Jettton had already done the math, already traced the line from Vera's shredded past to the foreclosure on his land, and saw now with painful clarity how tightly their tragedies had been woven by the same filthy hands. She bought this land legal, Jettton said, not loud but firm. Every word was slow and deliberate, like the click of a rifle being chambered. She saved those children with her own money, and you'll need more than a badge and a bad attitude to change that. The man, Sterling, Vera's stepbrother by blood and betrayer by choice, just smiled. "I've got papers," he said, waving a packet like a hand of cards at a rigged poker table. "Warrants, custody orders, all signed, all sealed. You can make this easy or hard." Vera stepped forward then, and the sun caught her face just right. Dirt-streaked, sweat-shined, but still proud. And she said, "Funny thing about seals, anyone can buy one if they know which judge drinks too early in the day." That's when he lost his smile. The next 3 days felt like holding one's breath underwater. They boarded up the house. They moved the babies into the root cellar. Jettton took watch from the porch, with his rifle across his lap, while Vera strung makeshift alarms, tin pans and spools of fishing line, between the outbuildings. At night they barely spoke. There was only the creak of old wood, the faint cry of a restless child, and the quiet sound of a woman's resolve hardening like iron in a fire. By the 4th morning the babies were sick. Rose burned with fever, her small chest rising too fast, and Brinley coughed so violently it shook her bones. The well water had turned stale, and the wind carried ash from something burning beyond the ridge. Vera held them both against her chest, whispering songs her mother used to hum while stitching aprons by candlelight. But her voice cracked, and her eyes kept darting to the window. And then, just past midnight, they came. No knocks, no warnings, just fire. The barn was the first to go. Flames burst through the slats like the devil himself had clawed his way up from the dirt, and Vera screamed for Jettton just as he rolled into the hallway, rifle in hand, face carved in stone. The smoke thickened fast, choking the night sky, and in the chaos she could hear Sterling's voice shouting, barking orders, calling her name like it belonged to him. But she didn't hesitate. She strapped Jetton's old field stretcher to the bottom of his wheelchair, loaded both babies into saddlebags lined with quilts, and with one hand on Jetton's back and the other clutching a pistol she hadn't fired since Texas, they slipped into the ravine trail behind the house, the one nobody used since the bridge collapsed years ago. The fire crackled behind them, hot enough to light the bluff, and the sound of hoofbeats thundered too close. But Vera didn't stop. She pushed, he wheeled, the babies whimpered, and the world roared. By the time they made it to the creek bed, Jettton had bled through his shirt, a shoulder grazed by a bullet, a cheek split by a falling beam. But still, he gripped the rifle, pointing it back up the trail even as his vision blurred. They would have died there if not for the sound of hooves from the opposite bank. It was Ryland and his wife, neighbors who'd stayed silent through months of drought and shame, now riding hard with lanterns swinging and buckshot ready. They'd seen the smoke, they'd heard the rumors, and they'd finally had enough. Sterling's men didn't expect resistance. They scattered. But by dawn, the barn was gone. The house was half collapsed, and Jettton was barely breathing. Rose's fever had broken, but Brinley was listless, and Vera's hands trembled too hard to lace her boots. She knew what she had to do. She left Jettton in Ryland's care. She took both babies, wrapped tight against her chest, and rode toward town with the last of her strength. No saddle, no backup, just prayers and desperation pushing her forward under a sun that didn't care whether she made it or not. When she returned 2 days later, blood still crusted on her sleeves and medicine in her bag, she found the ranch quiet but not peaceful. Jettton was gone, and Sterling was back. This time with new papers, a federal escort, and a cruel smile that stretched too wide. The town of Lasconas didn't look like much from the outside. Just one crooked street with a general store, a saloon that hadn't seen a piano in 20 years, and a post office that mostly served as a place for old men to sit and complain about dust. But it was the closest place with a doctor, and right now, That was all Vera needed it to be. She hadn't slept in 2 days. Her body ached from riding. Her mind felt like paper left out in the rain, thin, warped, and tearing at the edges. But still, she walked into that tiny clinic with both babies wrapped against her chest and asked in a voice that didn't tremble for the town physician by name. That was how she met Dr. Brinley Harrow, a man past 70, with eyes like river stone and hands that trembled until they touched a child's skin, then went as steady as the earth itself. He took one look at the twins, laid them gently on clean linen, and didn't speak for several minutes as he examined their lungs, their coloring, the hollows beneath their tiny eyes. "They're fighters," he said finally, his voice like soft thunder in a storm-weary world. "But you've got to stop running if you want them to make it." Vera sat in the corner, clutching the worn fabric of her skirt, and for the first time since the courthouse auction, she let the tears fall without hiding them. Not the loud, messy sobs of grief, but the silent kind. The ones that come when you realize how much you've held together with nothing but willpower and borrowed time. Over the next few hours, the babies rested under Brinley's care, while Vera, sore, hungry, and hollow, allowed herself the small, foreign mercy of being looked after. And just when she thought the night would end in stillness, the old doctor returned, holding a file folder that looked too heavy for its size. "I know who you are," he said gently as he handed her the papers. Inside were clippings from Texas newspapers, court dockets, arrest warrants marked "void" in red ink, and a notarized letter from a judge who had since died, clearing Vera's name, but never delivered. "Your stepbrother intercepted these," Brinley added. "He wanted you gone, but this town, it's still got a few people who believe in truth." Vera couldn't speak at first, could barely breathe, but she understood what he was giving her, a second chance, not just to survive, but to stand. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, things had gone quiet in a way that smelled like danger. Sterling had returned with what he claimed were federal papers, bought, borrowed, or forged, and Jettton, too weak to resist, had been taken under the pretense of protective custody, while the twins' names were scribbled across documents that meant nothing except power passed between liars. And when Vera rode back into town 3 days later, the medicine saddlebag still slung across her shoulder and a fire kindling slow beneath her ribs, she didn't walk into the saloon or the sheriff's office. She went straight to Brinley's barn, because tucked behind hay bales and rusted tools was something most people didn't know. A United States Marshal, long retired but still holding his badge, still keeping quiet watch over a town that had long forgotten its conscience. Brinley introduced them. The man, Ryland Ford, had eyes like burnt matches and a voice that never rose above a whisper. But when he read the papers, when he traced the chain of lies Sterling had spun across 3 counties, something shifted behind his jaw like a lock finally clicking into place. "I don't arrest families," he said, "but I do arrest corruption." The next morning, just before sunrise, Ryland rode out, flanked by 2 witnesses, 3 sets of notarized evidence, and the full weight of the United States government. Quiet, legal, and absolute. Vera didn't go with them. She waited, rocking the babies in the same quiet clinic where her story had started over, whispering soft words into soft heads, praying not for vengeance, but for something gentler. A clearing, a release. The kind of justice that doesn't burn, but instead restores. By midday, they came back. Jettton was in the front wagon, bloodied but breathing, his hand clutching the corner of a quilt she'd started stitching back when they still didn't speak without flinching. Sterling was behind him, manacled, no longer smirking, his star stripped from his chest, his voice silenced by the weight of everything he thought he controlled, now crumbling beneath him. The crowd in Lasconas was small, but they watched, and what they saw wasn't just a man being arrested. It was a woman reclaiming not just her name, but her story. Vera stood tall, pregnant, sleepless, unbroken. She walked straight to Jettton, took the quilt from his lap, and laid it gently across the twins asleep in the wagon bed. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The fire damage was still there. Blackened timber bones where a barn used to stand, charred fencing like broken teeth along the southern ridge, and a kitchen wall that still smelled faintly of smoke every time the wind blew through the rafters. But it no longer felt like a ruin, and certainly not like a grave. It felt like a beginning. Jettton, though still confined to the chair that had once felt like a prison, now rolled through the rebuilt hallway with a quiet sense of command. Not the kind of authority that shouted, but the kind that spoke through calloused hands, teaching a child how to hold reins, or through blue-gray eyes watching a calf take its first breath without panicking, or through the careful way he polished the nameplate Vera had carved into the porch beam herself, Rose Ranch, Est 1881. There were no parades, no grand public declarations. But in the hush of those golden post-trial days, something sacred took root. A rhythm, a ritual, a kind of peace that only arrives when people stop surviving and begin actually living. Vera gave birth just before the first frost, inside the very room where Jetton's daughter had once rocked herself to sleep. Her screams were muffled into an old quilt, her hands gripping Jetton's as if tethering herself to the living. And when the baby finally came, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Jettton cried, not like a man overcome, but like one finally released from something he didn't have a name for. They named the boy Ryland, after the marshal who rode when others stayed home. The man who taught them that justice was sometimes quiet and sometimes slow, but always worth waiting for. And now, the house that once held only grief began to fill with the sounds of children. Brinley and Rose, now sturdy, curious toddlers, no longer cried when Vera walked too far, or Jettton rolled into the next room. They trusted the world again, trusted the arms that held them, trusted the sun to rise and the fire to stay in the hearth where it belonged. Neighbors who once crossed the street now brought apple pies and old fence posts, offering them not out of guilt or pity, but out of something harder to earn in the West: respect. The cattle herd grew slowly, fattened on fresh clover and prayer. And Jettton, who once thought he'd never be useful again, found new purpose teaching Vera how to breed horses, how to read the sky for rain, how to mend saddle straps using only one good hand and a block of beeswax. And in the evenings, when the babies had gone quiet, when the lanterns glowed like fireflies caught in jars, when Vera's hair was unpinned and Jetton's rifle rested against the door not out of fear but habit, they finished the quilt together, every square a memory, every thread a vow. By spring it was done, a full-sized cover stitched from scraps of grief and grit and grace, now draped over the marriage bed they built together, plank by plank, laugh by laugh, touch by quiet touch. Yes, marriage. Not the rushed panic kind forced by fear, but a steady agreement made in front of the same doctor who once carried Vera's past in a folder and now carried her name in a new family Bible. No fanfare, just two people signing a ledger and then pressing their foreheads together as the twins clapped in confusion and the baby fussed against Jetton's chest. The land, once deeded to a stranger, was now split between two names, hers and his. And by legal order, the twins were adopted as their own, no longer assets in a foreclosure list, but daughters in a family that had earned each other through fire, through mercy, and through impossible hope. And word spread, as it always does, in places that claim to forget but never really do. Not about the bank papers or the fire or the trial, but about her. The pregnant woman who bought a broken ranch with the last of her savings. The stranger who became a mother. The accused who became the protector. The drifter who stitched her name into the soil and didn't leave when it hurt. And about him. The crippled rancher who wouldn't beg and wouldn't yield, but made room in his broken world for something new and dared to believe it wasn't too late to begin again. Together, they weren't saints. They were just stubborn. And sometimes, stubbornness is the last holy thing on this side of heaven. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale where courage and loyalty triumph against impossible odds. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.